My father called his affair son the child he always wanted. I made him lose both families. My dad was always this larger-than-life guy who coached my little league team and never missed a school play. He'd wake up at 5 to make me pancakes shaped like dinosaurs before school and taught me to drive in the parking lot of an abandoned mall. When I graduated from high school, he cried harder than my mom. He had this workshop in the garage where we'd build model airplanes every Sunday, and he'd tell me stories about his dad doing the same with him. I thought I had the best father in the world. Even through college, he'd call me every Wednesday just to check in and send care packages with homemade cookies and stupid dad jokes written on index cards. That all changed 6 months ago at my cousin Alli's wedding. Dad was giving a toast when this woman walked in with a teenage boy. Dad went white and dropped his champagne glass. Mom asked who they were, and the woman said she was Denise and the boy was Tyler, my dad's son. Turns out Dad had a whole other family for 14 years. Tyler was 3 years younger than me. The math was pretty easy to figure out. While Dad was teaching me to ride a bike, he was also buying Tyler his first tricycle. While he was at my basketball games, he was also at Tyler's soccer practice. Denise knew about us the whole time, but stayed because Dad paid for everything. Mom didn't know anything until that moment at the wedding. She walked out and filed for divorce the next day. Dad tried to explain, but there wasn't much to explain when Tyler looked exactly like him. The really sick part started after Mom moved out. Dad decided to bring Tyler around like everything was normal. He introduced Tyler to all his friends as his athletic son, who was going to play college football. He never mentioned I existed to these same people. At the hardware store, he told Carl, who'd known me since I was 5, that Tyler was the son who actually enjoyed building things with him. I was standing right there. Carl looked at me, then back at Dad like he'd lost his mind. Dad started posting pictures with Tyler on Facebook with captions about finally having someone who understood him. He wrote this long post about how Tyler was teaching him things about being a father that he had never learned before. My aunt called me crying because she couldn't believe her brother would write that. The breaking point was Thanksgiving. Dad invited everyone to his house and said he wanted to introduce Tyler properly to the family. He stood up before dinner and gave this speech about how Tyler was the child he'd always dreamed of having, someone who shared his interests and made him proud every day. He said Tyler was his second chance at being the father he wanted to be. My mom's parents were there. They'd driven 3 hours because Dad begged them to meet Tyler. Grandpa stood up and left without eating. Grandma followed. Dad kept going, talking about how Tyler was everything he'd hoped for in a son. That's when I decided Dad needed to lose both families. First, I reached out to Denise. Told her I wanted to get to know Tyler better. She was thrilled because she thought it meant more money from Dad if we all got along. I found out that Dad had been telling Denise he was getting divorced for 14 years. He'd promised to marry her once I graduated high school, then college, then once I got a job. She'd been waiting for him to leave Mom the whole time. I asked Denise if she knew about Dad's gambling problem. She didn't know what I was talking about. I told her about his secret credit cards, the second mortgage he'd taken out, the retirement fund he'd emptied. All lies, but she didn't know that. I showed her fake bank statements I'd made showing Dad was $300,000 in debt. She panicked and started going through Dad's stuff when he was at work. She found the real bank statements, which showed he had plenty of money, just in an account she didn't have access to. She also found receipts for jewelry he'd bought that she'd never received. Turns out Dad had a third woman named Katie he'd been seeing for 2 years. Denise confronted Dad about Katie. Dad denied it until Denise called Katie right in front of him. Katie thought Dad was single and had been planning to introduce him to her parents at Christmas. Both women dumped him the same day. Tyler refused to see him after learning Dad had been lying to his mom their entire relationship. But that wasn't enough. I spent the next 3 days going through every financial record I could find in Dad's house while he was at work. Mom still had a key from when they were married, and she gave it to me without asking questions. I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway, then let myself in through the back door like I'd done 1,000 times as a kid. The house smelled different now, stale and empty without Mom's candles burning or her music playing in the kitchen. I went straight to Dad's home office and started pulling open desk drawers. His filing system was the same as always, everything labeled and organized because he couldn't stand mess. I found bank statements going back 5 years, credit card bills in folders marked by year, and a locked metal box in the bottom drawer that I pried open with a screwdriver from his own workshop. Inside were more statements, these ones for accounts I'd never seen before. One showed regular transfers of $2,000 every month to an account in Denise's name. Another showed cash withdrawals of $500 weekly, way more than anyone needs for normal spending. I took pictures of everything with my phone, making sure to get clear shots of the account numbers and dates. Then I logged into his computer because Dad never changed his passwords, and I'd watched him type them in since I was 12. His email password had always been some version of Rusty, our golden retriever who died when I was in middle school. I tried Rusty 2009, the year he died, and the inbox opened right up. The first thing I saw made my hands shake. Dating site notifications filled his inbox, dozens of them from 3 different sites. Match, eHarmony, and some other one I'd never heard of called Silver Singles. I clicked on his sent messages folder and started reading. Every single woman he talked to got the same story about being a divorced dad with one son who played college football. He described Tyler's stats, his position on the team, even sent pictures of Tyler in his uniform. I scrolled back through 2 years of messages and never saw my name mentioned once. To every woman he met online, I didn't exist. He'd erased me completely, rewritten his entire life story without me in it. I found conversations with at least 30 different women, some lasting a few messages, others going on for months. He told them all he was looking for a serious relationship, that he was done playing games, that he wanted to find his forever person. The lies came so easily to him, like he'd practiced them until they felt true. I kept digging and found flight confirmations in his email. Vegas in March, Miami in July, Chicago in September, and again in November. I cross-referenced the dates with his work calendar that synced to his email, and none of them matched up with actual business trips his company held. I called his office pretending to be him and asked the receptionist to confirm which conferences he'd attended this year. She listed 3 cities, none of them matching his flight records. The hotel reservations were all for 2 people, king beds, late checkouts. He'd been flying women out to meet him, or flying to meet them, spending money on romantic getaways while telling mom he was working overtime to save for retirement. I downloaded every confirmation email and saved them to a folder on my phone. One name kept appearing more than others in recent emails. Willow Tanaka from Chicago. Their email chain went back 8 months, and the messages got more serious as time went on. Dad wrote about visiting her next month, about how he couldn't wait to finally be with someone who understood him. He said she made him feel young again, that talking to her was the best part of his day. She wrote back about introducing him to her parents over Christmas, about looking at apartments they could share once he relocated to Chicago for work. He'd told her his company was opening a Chicago office, and he'd requested the transfer to be closer to her. Complete lies. His company had no Chicago office. I read through 50 emails between them, watching Dad construct an entire fake future with this woman who had no idea she was played the same way he'd played Denise, Katie, and probably dozens of others. I called Mom from Dad's driveway after locking up his house. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear Owen in the background asking if everything was okay. I told her I found something she needed to know about, something that might affect her divorce settlement. She went quiet for a long moment, then asked me to come over right away. I drove to her new apartment across town, the small 1-bedroom she'd rented after leaving the house she'd lived in for 25 years. She opened the door in sweatpants and one of my old college shirts, looking tired but stronger somehow than she had at Thanksgiving. I spread out the printed bank statements on her kitchen table and showed her the hidden accounts, the cash withdrawals, the transfers to Denise. She stared at the papers without touching them, her jaw getting tighter with each page I explained. Mom picked up her phone and called her divorce lawyer right there in front of me, putting him on speaker. His name was Richard something, and he sounded annoyed until Mom explained what I'd found. Then his tone changed completely. He started asking specific questions about account numbers and dates, telling Mom to bring everything to his office first thing Monday morning. He said if Dad had hidden assets during the divorce proceedings, they could reopen the settlement, and Mom could be entitled to half of everything he'd concealed. He used words like fraud and perjury, his voice getting more excited as Mom described the amounts involved. The lawyer said he'd file for a subpoena of Dad's complete financial records going back 7 years, that the judge wouldn't look kindly on someone who'd lied under oath about their assets. He told Mom this could mean a significant increase in her settlement, possibly even criminal charges against Dad depending on what they found. The subpoena got served to Dad at work 2 weeks later. I know because he called me at 8 at night, screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He said I was trying to destroy him, that I was turning into a vindictive person he didn't recognize. I let him yell for a full minute before I said anything. Then I told him very calmly that he destroyed himself when he spent 14 years lying to everyone who loved him. I said he destroyed himself when he stood up at Thanksgiving and called Tyler the child he always wanted while I sat there watching. I told him he was a lying piece of garbage who deserved everything coming to him, and then I hung up. He called back 6 times, but I didn't answer. He left voicemails crying and begging me to call off the lawyers, saying he'd lose everything. I deleted them all without listening to the end. While Dad dealt with lawyers and subpoenas, I opened Facebook and searched for Willow Tanaka. Her profile was public, full of pictures from Chicago, photos of her at restaurants and museums, shots of Lake Michigan from her apartment window. She was pretty, probably in her early 40s, with dark hair and a smile that looked genuine. I sent her a message introducing myself as Dad's son and saying I'd like to talk if she had time. I kept it simple, didn't mention anything about his lies yet. She responded within an hour, her message friendly but confused. She said Dad had mentioned he had a son, but that they weren't close because of the divorce, that I lived far away and they didn't talk much. I told her I actually lived in the same town as Dad, and we could meet whenever she was free. She said she was flying in next week to surprise Dad for his birthday, and maybe we could grab coffee before she saw him. I agreed, and gave her my number. The following week, I met Willow at a coffee shop downtown, arriving early with 2 photo albums I'd taken from Mom's apartment. They were the big old-fashioned kind with plastic sleeves, filled with pictures from my entire childhood. Me as a baby in Dad's arms. Me and Dad building my first model airplane. Dad coaching my little league team. Dad and me at my high school graduation. Every major moment of my life documented with Dad right there beside me. Willow walked in wearing a blue dress and carrying a gift bag, probably Dad's birthday present. I stood up and waved, and she smiled and came over. We ordered coffee and sat down at a corner table. I opened the first album and turned it so she could see. Her smile faded as she looked at the first page, then the second, then started flipping faster through the years. The color drained from her face. She looked up at me, then back at the photos, then at me again. I watched her hands start shaking as she realized every single picture showed Dad with a son he'd told her didn't exist in his life anymore. She went through both albums without saying a word, and when she finished, she just sat there staring at a picture of Dad and me at my college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. I watched her fingers shake as she closed the second album and pushed it across the table toward me. She picked up her coffee cup but didn't drink, just held it with both hands like she needed something to grip. Her eyes were red and wet when she finally looked up at me again. She set down the cup and pulled out her phone, scrolling through something before turning the screen toward me. It was a text from Dad sent 3 days ago about how excited he was to see her next week and how he couldn't wait to start their life together. She scrolled up to show me months of messages where he talked about being ready for a real relationship after his failed marriage, about finally finding someone who understood him, about building a future with her in this town where his only son Tyler lived far away and they barely spoke anymore. I pulled out my own phone and opened the folder I'd created with screenshots of Dad's emails. I found the thread with someone named Katie and turned my phone so she could see the dates. The messages went back 2 years, with the most recent one from 8 weeks ago, right around the time Dad was telling her he loved her and wanted to marry her. She read through them without saying anything, her face getting paler with each swipe. The emails showed Dad planning trips with Katie to the same cities he'd told her were work conferences, using almost the exact same romantic language he'd used in his text to her. She handed my phone back and reached into her purse for a tissue, wiping her eyes carefully so her makeup wouldn't smear. She asked me if there were others besides Katie, and I told her probably, based on the dating site activity I'd found in his email. She laughed, but it came out bitter and broken, nothing like the happy sound from when she'd first walked into the coffee shop. She twisted the engagement ring on her finger, a simple silver band with a small diamond that caught the light from the window. She pulled it off slowly, like it hurt to remove, and set it in the middle of the table between our coffee cups. She told me she'd mail it back to him with a letter explaining exactly why she was done, how she'd learned the truth from his son, who actually existed and lived in the same town. She stood up and grabbed her purse and the gift bag she'd brought for his birthday. She thanked me for telling her before she moved her whole life here for a man who'd been lying since the day they met. I watched her walk out of the coffee shop and get into her rental car, and I felt the first real satisfaction I'd had since that Thanksgiving dinner. Dad called me at 11 that night, so drunk I could barely understand him through the slurring and yelling. He was screaming about how I was destroying his happiness, asking what gave me the right to ruin his relationship with someone who actually cared about him. I let him rant for a full minute before I said anything at all. Then I told him very calmly that he destroyed his own happiness when he spent 14 years lying to everyone who loved him. I said he destroyed himself when he stood up at Thanksgiving and called Tyler the child he always wanted while I sat right there watching with my grandparents. I told him he was a lying piece of garbage who deserved everything coming to him, and I hung up while he was still trying to talk. He called back 6 times in a row, but I let every single one go to voicemail. I listened to the first message where he was crying and begging me to call off whatever I'd told her, saying she was the one good thing he had left and I was taking it away just to hurt him. I deleted all 6 messages without listening to the rest, because I didn't care what excuses he wanted to make. The next morning, I called Mom and told her about the bank account I'd found in Dad's email records, the one with almost $200,000 that he never mentioned during the divorce. She was quiet for a long time before she asked if I was sure about the amount. I sent her screenshots of the statements showing deposits going back years, money he'd been hiding while claiming he couldn't afford a fair settlement. She said she'd forward everything to her lawyer right away. 3 days later, her lawyer called her with news that made her actually laugh for the first time since the wedding. He said Dad's financial records showed clear evidence of hidden assets and fraud during the divorce proceedings. Mom was entitled to half of that money plus penalties for his dishonesty, which meant her settlement would increase by over $100,000. He told her this could also mean criminal charges against Dad, depending on what else they found when they dug deeper. Mom asked me to thank whoever had found those records, and I told her I'd pass along the message. I spent that evening creating a detailed document with every fake work trip I'd found in Dad's email, complete with flight confirmations and hotel reservations that didn't match any actual business events his company had held. I included receipts he'd submitted for reimbursement, claiming client dinners in cities where his company had no clients. I wrote it all up in a professional format, like I was doing the company a favor by reporting potential fraud. I created a new email address with a generic name and sent the whole package to his company's HR department with a subject line about expense report concerns. I got an automated reply thanking me for the information and saying they'd investigate. 2 weeks later, I was at the grocery store when I ran into someone from Dad's office who I'd met at a company picnic years ago. She recognized me and came over to ask how I was doing, then lowered her voice and said she was sorry to hear about my dad's suspension. I acted surprised and asked what happened. She told me the company was investigating him for expense fraud after someone sent in documentation of personal trips he'd billed as business travel. She said it looked pretty bad because they'd found over $50,000 in questionable charges going back 3 years. I thanked her for telling me and finished my shopping while trying not to smile. That night, I opened Instagram and searched for Tyler's account. He had it set to private, but I sent him a follow request with a message saying I was his half-brother and I wanted to talk if he was interested. He didn't respond for 2 days, and I started to think he'd blocked me. Then I got a notification that he'd accepted my request and sent a message back asking what I wanted. I told him I thought he deserved to know the full truth about our father, not just the version Dad had been feeding him. He wrote back saying his mom already told him everything and he didn't want to hear more lies. I sent him 3 screenshots as proof, one showing Dad's active dating profiles, one showing the hidden bank account, and one showing the expense fraud investigation. I told him these weren't lies, they were facts I could prove with documentation. He read the messages but didn't respond for an hour. Then he sent back a single word asking where we could meet. I met Tyler at a diner near his school 2 days later. He showed up wearing his football jacket and sat across from me without saying anything for a minute. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping much. I ordered coffee and he got a soda, and we just sat there until the waitress left. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me the call log. Dad's name appeared 37 times over the past week. Tyler scrolled through the voicemails and played one on low volume. Dad's voice came through shaky and desperate, talking about how I was poisoning everyone against him and how Tyler was the only person who truly understood him. The message ended with Dad crying and saying he couldn't lose his son again. Tyler played another one where Dad blamed me for ruining his life and turning his own family into enemies. Then another where Dad promised to make everything right if Tyler would just give him one more chance. I asked Tyler what he wanted to do about it. He put his phone away and said he didn't know anymore. I told him he should do whatever felt right for him, but he deserved to know the truth about who Dad really was before making any decisions. Tyler asked what I meant by that, and I reminded him about the dating profiles, the hidden money, the lies to his mom for 14 years. I told him those weren't mistakes or one-time things. That was who Dad chose to be every single day. We ended up staying at that diner for 3 hours. Tyler started talking about memories he had with Dad, things he thought made him special. Dad taking him to football camps while telling him he was proud to have an athletic son. Dad buying him equipment and bragging to other parents about Tyler's stats. Dad showing up to games and cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. Tyler always thought those moments meant something, that Dad chose to be with him because he was worth it. But then he started remembering other things. How Dad would leave suddenly without explanation. How Dad never let Tyler post pictures of them together on social media. How Dad refused to meet Tyler's friends or come to the school events where other parents might see them together. I shared my own stories about Dad's lies. The times Dad missed my events because he was with Tyler instead. The Facebook posts about Tyler being the son who understood him. That Thanksgiving speech about Tyler being everything he'd hoped for in a son. We realized Dad had been playing the same game with both of us, making each of us feel special while using us both as props in his fake life. Tyler got quiet and said he always believed he was different because Dad chose him despite having another family. Now he understood he wasn't special at all. He was just another person Dad manipulated to make himself feel important. Tyler looked at me across the table and asked if I hated him for being Dad's favorite. I thought about it for a minute before answering honestly. I told him I did hate him at first, especially after that Thanksgiving speech. But now I realized we were both victims of Dad's narcissism. Dad didn't love either of us. He loved the idea of having sons who made him look good. Tyler was the athletic one Dad could brag about. I was the academic one Dad could show off when it suited him. Neither of us got a real father. We got a performer who used us as supporting actors in his show. Tyler's eyes got wet and he nodded. We exchanged phone numbers before leaving the diner. He said he wanted to stay in touch and maybe figure out how to be actual brothers instead of the competition Dad tried to make us. I agreed and told him I'd answer whenever he called, which was more than Dad ever did for either of us. 3 weeks after I sent that anonymous email to Dad's company, I got a text from my aunt. She'd heard through family gossip that Dad got fired. I called her back and she told me the company found over $50,000 in fraudulent expenses going back 3 years. Dad had been billing personal trips as business travel, claiming client dinners in cities where the company had no clients, and submitting fake receipts for reimbursement. The company demanded immediate repayment and threatened criminal charges if he didn't comply within 30 days. My aunt said Dad tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too clear. Flight records didn't match any company events. Hotel stays happened on weekends when no business was conducted. Restaurant receipts showed meals for 2 in cities where Dad had no legitimate reason to be. The company's legal team told him he was lucky they weren't prosecuting right away, but they wanted their money back first. Dad had 30 days to come up with $50,000 or face criminal fraud charges. 2 weeks later, I drove past Dad's house and saw a for sale sign on the lawn. I pulled over and looked it up on my phone. The listing said it was priced below market value for a quick sale. The description mentioned motivated seller and immediate possession available. I did the math in my head. Mom's divorce settlement adjustment would take a big chunk of Dad's savings. The $50,000 in expense fraud repayment would take another huge piece. His legal fees for fighting Mom's claims were probably adding up fast. Between all of it, Dad couldn't afford to keep the house anymore. The same house where he stood up at Thanksgiving and told everyone Tyler was the child he'd always wanted was now being sold at a loss because Dad needed cash immediately. I sat in my car looking at that for sale sign and felt nothing but satisfaction. The estate sale happened on a Saturday morning. I showed up early and walked through Dad's house, seeing all his stuff laid out on tables with price tags. His tools from the garage workshop where we used to build model airplanes together, his fishing gear from trips he claimed to take for work but actually took with his girlfriends, his furniture, his books, his clothes, everything was for sale. I found boxes in the garage marked with my name. Inside were my Little League trophies, the model airplanes we'd built together, photos of us from when I was a kid. He'd packed away every reminder of me like I was something to be erased. I bought everything in those boxes. I paid the estate sale worker and carried the boxes to my car. Dad was standing in the driveway watching. I loaded the boxes in my trunk, and when I turned around, he was crying. Tears running down his face, just standing there watching me take back the pieces of my childhood he'd tried to throw away. I got in my car and drove off without saying a word to him. Grandpa called me that night. His voice was shaking with anger. He said Dad showed up at their house that afternoon, begging Mom's parents to convince her to drop the additional financial claims. Dad told them he was losing everything and needed help. Grandpa said he told Dad to get off his property before he called the police. Grandma wouldn't even come to the door. She stayed inside and let Grandpa handle it. Dad tried to argue that he was still family, that they'd known him for over 20 years, that he deserved some compassion. Grandpa said the only thing Dad deserved was exactly what he was getting. Then he told Dad if he ever showed up at their house again, Grandpa would file a restraining order. Dad left crying and Grandpa watched him drive away. Grandpa told me he was proud of me for standing up to Dad and not letting him get away with his lies anymore. I drove across town a few days later and passed Dad's new apartment building. It was a small complex on the edge of town, the kind of place with thin walls and broken parking lot lights. I saw Dad outside unloading boxes from a U-Haul by himself. No friends helping him move. No family around to support him. Just a middle-aged man in a stained t-shirt carrying boxes up a flight of stairs alone. His face was red and sweaty. He looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk since losing everything. I slowed down as I passed and watched him struggle with a heavy box, nearly dropping it on the stairs. Nobody came out to help him. Nobody checked if he was okay. He was completely alone, facing the consequences of decades of lies with nobody left who cared enough to stand by him. I kept driving and didn't look back. My phone rang a week later and Alli's name popped up. I hadn't talked to her since right after the wedding when everything exploded. She asked how I was doing and then apologized for not warning anyone about Denise and Tyler showing up at her wedding. She said she'd known they might come but didn't want to cause drama before the ceremony. I laughed and told her she did me the biggest favor of my life by letting the truth come out. If Denise and Tyler hadn't walked into that wedding, I might have gone years more without knowing about Dad's secret family. Alli said she felt guilty about how everything unfolded, but I told her she had nothing to feel guilty about. Dad's lies were going to come out eventually. Her wedding just happened to be the place where his fake life finally collapsed. She seemed relieved and said she was glad I wasn't angry with her. Mom called me a few days after that, sounding happier than I'd heard her in months. She told me she'd been on 3 dates with a guy named Owen Woodward, who she met through a friend at work. He was divorced with 2 grown kids who he actually had good relationships with. He showed up on time for their dates, called when he said he would, and treated her with respect. Mom laughed while telling me about their last date, where Owen brought her flowers and took her to a nice restaurant without complaining about the cost. She said it felt strange being with someone who actually wanted to spend time with her instead of someone who treated her like an obligation. I listened to her talk about Owen and realized how much stress Dad had put her through even before the divorce. She'd spent 20 years with someone who made her feel like she wasn't enough, who was always looking for something better, who treated their marriage like a burden instead of a partnership. Now she was laughing again, making plans again, feeling valued again. Watching Mom find happiness with someone decent made me realize Dad had been destroying her slowly for years, and she was finally free. Tyler texted me 3 days after Mom started dating Owen and asked if I wanted to grab lunch at this diner halfway between our towns. I drove 40 minutes and found him already sitting in a corner booth, looking nervous and picking at the edge of the menu. He stood up when he saw me, and we did this awkward handshake thing that turned into a half hug. We ordered burgers and didn't talk about Dad for the first 20 minutes. Tyler told me about his football team and how his coach wanted him to try out for quarterback. I told him about my job search and how I was thinking about moving to a different city. Then he put down his burger and said he'd been thinking about changing his last name. He didn't want to be associated with Dad anymore. He said every time someone asked if he was related to Dad, he felt sick, because now he knew what kind of person Dad really was. I told him I understood completely and that he should do whatever felt right for him. We agreed to meet for lunch every other week, just the two of us, building something real instead of whatever fake relationship Dad had tried to force on us. Tyler paid for lunch even though I offered, and when we walked to our cars, he told me he was glad we were actually getting to know each other now. I ran into my friend Matthew from college at the grocery store the next week, and he pulled me aside near the produce section with this weird look on his face. He asked if everything was okay with me, and I said yeah, why wouldn't it be? Matthew said he'd heard from a few people that I was going through some mental health stuff and that Dad was worried about me. I felt my whole body go cold because I knew exactly what was happening. Matthew said Dad had been telling people I was unstable and had made up lies about him to try to steal his money during the divorce. I thanked Matthew for telling me and went straight home to my laptop. I opened a new document and started compiling everything I had. Every email I'd found in Dad's account. Every screenshot of his dating profiles. Every bank statement showing the hidden money. Every receipt for jewelry he bought Katie and Willow. Every text message where he admitted to lying. I organized it all by date and created a timeline that showed exactly what Dad had done and when he'd done it. I added notes explaining the context of each piece of evidence. I saved the whole thing as a PDF and backed it up in 3 different places. Then I sent copies to Mom, Tyler, and my aunt, with a note saying this was the truth if anyone asked. I also printed out a physical copy and put it in a folder in my desk drawer. If Dad wanted to play the victim and claim I was crazy, I had proof that would shut down his lies immediately. My phone rang 2 days later while I was making dinner, and my aunt's name popped up on the screen. I answered, and she was crying, so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said Dad had shown up at her house that afternoon, asking to borrow $15,000. He told her the divorce had left him broke, and he needed help getting back on his feet. My aunt said she asked him why he needed money if he hadn't done anything wrong like he kept claiming. Dad got defensive and said the divorce settlement was unfair, and Mom's lawyer had stolen from him. My aunt told him she'd seen my timeline and knew the truth about everything. She said Dad tried to argue that I'd made it all up, but she'd verified some of the information herself by calling other family members. Dad got angry and started yelling that everyone was turning against him for no reason. My aunt told him to leave her property and said she was done with him completely. She told him she didn't recognize her brother anymore. When she called me, she was still shaking from the confrontation. I told her Dad had always been this person. He'd just hidden it better before. She said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, and I said he'd fooled all of us for years. She thanked me for putting together the timeline because it helped her see the full picture of his lies. She said she was blocking his number and wanted nothing to do with him going forward. Mom's divorce lawyer called me the following week and asked if I could come to her office for a meeting. I drove over during my lunch break, and she had all of Dad's financial records spread out on her conference table. She said the investigation into Dad's hidden assets had turned up even more evidence of fraud. Dad had deliberately underreported his income during the divorce proceedings and hidden money in accounts he never disclosed. The lawyer said we had enough evidence to pursue criminal charges for financial fraud and perjury. She explained that Dad could face jail time if we moved forward with pressing charges. I asked what Mom wanted to do, and the lawyer said Mom was thinking about it. Mom called me that night and said she'd decided the additional settlement money was enough. She didn't want to spend more months or years dealing with Dad in criminal court. She said she just wanted to move on with her life and put all of this behind her. I told her I understood, and that I supported whatever decision she made. Mom said the extra settlement would let her pay off the house and have a good cushion in savings. She sounded lighter than she had in months, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She said Owen had been supportive through the whole legal process and never made her feel bad about the drama with Dad. I was glad she had someone decent in her life now. I started seeing a therapist the next week because I couldn't sleep and kept having dreams where I was back at that Thanksgiving dinner, watching Dad give his speech about Tyler. The therapist's office was in a small building downtown with plants in the waiting room and soft music playing. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who asked me to tell her what brought me in. I explained everything from the wedding 6 months ago to the present, including all the revenge I'd taken on Dad. She listened without judging and asked questions about how I was feeling. I told her I was angry all the time and couldn't stop thinking about ways to make Dad suffer more. She said anger was a normal response to betrayal, but carrying it constantly was hurting me more than him. Over the next few sessions, she helped me understand that Dad's actions were never about me not being good enough. She explained that Dad's behavior showed his own inability to be a decent human being, not any failure on my part. She said people who truly love their children don't compare them or play favorites the way Dad did. She helped me see that Dad's need to have multiple families and constant validation from different women came from something broken inside him. I started sleeping better after a few weeks of therapy. The anger was still there, but it didn't control me the same way anymore. Tyler called me on a Tuesday afternoon sounding excited and nervous at the same time. He said he'd finally confronted Dad about everything and told him they were done. Tyler had gone to Dad's apartment with his phone recording the whole conversation in his pocket. Dad tried the same manipulation tactics he always used, saying everyone was lying about him and he'd been a good father who didn't deserve this treatment. Tyler played me parts of the recording and I could hear Dad's voice getting louder as Tyler refused to back down. Dad tried to blame Denise for poisoning Tyler against him. He tried to blame me for making up stories. He tried to blame Mom for starting the divorce. He blamed everyone except himself for his own choices. Tyler said listening back to the recording made him realize how Dad never took responsibility for anything. Dad kept saying things like, if only Denise had been more understanding, or if only Mom hadn't overreacted at the wedding. Tyler told him the relationship was over, and he didn't want Dad contacting him anymore. Dad apparently started crying and begging for another chance, but Tyler left. Tyler said he felt free for the first time in months. He said he'd spent his whole life thinking Dad was this great person who chose to be with him despite having another family. Now he understood Dad had just been using him as another prop in his fake perfect life. I was at the hardware store the next Saturday buying paint for my apartment when I saw Carl working at the customer service desk. He spotted me and waved me over, then asked one of his coworkers to cover for him. Carl pulled me aside near the lumber section and said he needed to apologize for something. He brought up that day months ago when Dad had introduced Tyler as his only son who liked building things. Carl said he should have said something right then instead of just standing there. He said he'd known me since I was 5 years old, and it was wrong of him to stay silent while Dad erased me like that. I told Carl I appreciated him saying that now. Carl said he'd heard through the town gossip about everything that had happened with Dad's secret families and his lies. He said a lot of people in town were talking about it, and most of them thought Dad got what he deserved. Carl told me my grandpa had come into the store a few weeks ago and told him the whole story. Grandpa had made it clear that anyone who sided with Dad would have to answer to him. I laughed because that sounded exactly like something Grandpa would do. Carl said if I ever needed anything to just ask, and he meant it. I thanked him and bought my paint. It felt good knowing people in town understood what really happened instead of believing whatever lies Dad was spreading. I was scrolling through Facebook that night when a notification popped up showing Dad had sent me a friend request. I clicked on it and saw he'd included a long message. The message said he was getting help through therapy and a support group for people dealing with family estrangement. He said he wanted to make amends and rebuild our relationship. He wrote that he understood he'd made mistakes, but he was working on becoming a better person. He said he missed me and hoped we could talk soon. I read the message 3 times and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just emptiness. I took a screenshot of the entire message and saved it to the evidence folder on my computer. Then I blocked Dad on Facebook and every other social media platform I had. I added the screenshot to my timeline document with a note about the date and time he'd sent it. If Dad ever tried to claim I was the one who cut him off or refused to give him a chance, I had proof that I'd blocked him after months of his behavior, not before. I also had proof of what his version of an apology looked like, which was mostly excuses and vague promises without any real acknowledgement of what he'd actually done wrong. Mom called me the following week with the best news I'd heard in months. Her settlement money had finally come through, and she wanted to take me, Grandpa, and Grandma on a vacation to Hawaii. She said she'd already booked a beach house for a week and bought plane tickets for all of us. I asked if she was sure she wanted to spend the money that way, and she said absolutely. She said after 20 years of being married to Dad and dealing with his lies, she wanted to do something good with the money she'd gotten from the divorce. We flew out 2 weeks later and spent 7 days on the beach doing nothing but relaxing. Grandpa went fishing every morning and came back with stories about the other fishermen he'd met. Grandma collected shells and made a whole display on the kitchen counter of the beach house. Mom and I went snorkeling one afternoon and saw sea turtles swimming near the reef. We ate dinner together every night at different restaurants and never once talked about Dad. It was like he didn't exist for that entire week. Mom laughed more than I'd seen her laugh in years. She and Owen talked on the phone every night, and she'd come back from those calls smiling. Grandpa told me on the last day that this was what family was supposed to feel like. People who actually cared about each other spending time together because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated. I realized he was right. This trip with Mom and my grandparents felt more like family than any holiday dinner Dad had ever hosted. I got back from Hawaii to find an email waiting in my inbox from a company in another state offering me a job with a 40% pay increase from what I was currently making. They wanted me to start in 6 weeks. I stared at the offer letter for a long time, thinking about what it would mean to leave this town. Every street here had memories of Dad. The park where he coached my little league team. The high school where he came to my games. The hardware store where he pretended I didn't exist. The restaurant where we used to get pancakes on Sunday mornings. I'd spent my whole life in this place, and so much of it was connected to him. I called Mom and told her about the offer. She said I should absolutely take it. She said I deserved to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without all these memories weighing me down. She said she'd miss me, but she wanted me to have my own life away from all this drama. I accepted the job that night and gave my notice at my current company the next morning. I started looking at apartments online in my new city and felt excited for the first time in months. I was finally going to leave this town and all of Dad's lies behind. Tyler and I met for coffee the week before my move and spread out college brochures across the table between us. He'd circled 3 schools within driving distance of my new city and marked the football programs with different colored highlighters. I told him he should pick the school that felt right for him, not just the one closest to me, but he said having family nearby actually mattered to him now. We made plans for him to visit once I got settled, maybe come see my new apartment and check out the local area. He asked if I'd help him with his college applications, and I said absolutely, thinking about how Dad never helped me with mine because he was too busy with whatever lies he was telling that week. Tyler saved the brochures in a folder labeled New Start, and we took a selfie together that he posted with a caption about having a real brother for the first time. The comments filled up with support from people who knew our story, and I noticed Dad wasn't tagged in the post. My last night in the apartment, I was taping up the final boxes when someone knocked on my door around 9. I looked through the peephole and saw Dad standing there in a wrinkled shirt, holding what looked like a grocery store bouquet. He knocked again and called my name, his voice cracking on the second syllable. I stood there watching him through the tiny circle of glass, remembering every Wednesday phone call, every care package, every time he made me feel like I mattered. Then I remembered the hardware store with Carl, the Facebook posts about Tyler, that speech at Thanksgiving. I pressed my palm against the door and spoke loud enough for him to hear through the wood. I told him he'd had my entire childhood to be a real father, 23 years of chances to treat me like I was worth something, and he'd chosen to waste all of it pretending I wasn't good enough. He started to respond, but I talked over him, saying I was done listening to excuses and explanations that never actually explained anything. The door stayed closed between us. I heard him slide something under the door after a few minutes of silence. The envelope was white and thick, my name written across the front in his handwriting. I picked it up and held it for maybe 30 seconds, feeling the weight of whatever apology or justification he'd written inside. Then I walked to the kitchen and dropped it in the trash without opening it. Nothing he could write would undo 20-plus years of lies and the deliberate cruelty of standing up at Thanksgiving to tell everyone that Tyler was the child he'd always wanted. No combination of words on paper could erase him telling Carl I wasn't the son who enjoyed building things, or posting on Facebook that Tyler taught him how to be a father. I tied up the trash bag and carried it to the dumpster outside, leaving his letter buried under coffee grounds and takeout containers. Mom showed up at 7 the next morning with coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Tyler arrived 20 minutes later driving his mom's car, wearing a football jersey and looking nervous about whether this was okay. I hugged him and told him I was glad he came, then handed him the first box to load. We worked in a chain, Mom bringing boxes from the apartment, me carrying them down the stairs, Tyler loading them into the truck I'd rented. The rhythm felt good, the 3 of us working together without anyone pretending or lying about who we were to each other. When the truck was finally packed, we stood in front of it, and Mom asked a passing neighbor to take our photo. We smiled with our arms around each other, genuine smiles that reached our eyes. I posted it on Facebook with a caption about family being the people who show up for you, not the ones who share your DNA. Within an hour, it had 50 likes and a dozen comments from relatives saying they were proud of me. The new city felt clean in a way my hometown never could. My coworkers knew me as the new guy from the marketing department who brought good ideas to meetings and stayed late to finish projects. They didn't know about Dad's secret families or Thanksgiving speeches or any of the mess I'd left behind. I learned the streets, found a good coffee shop near my apartment, started going to a gym 3 blocks away. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of Dad's betrayal sitting on my chest like a physical thing. I'd wake up in the morning and have coffee without wondering if today would be the day I'd run into him at the grocery store or see him driving past. The distance felt like medicine. Tyler called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could hear him crying before he said a single word. For a second, my stomach dropped, thinking something terrible had happened. But then he managed to get out that he'd been accepted to state with a partial football scholarship. I sat down on my couch and felt this wave of pride that surprised me with its intensity. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it in a way that felt different from anything Dad had ever said to me. I promised I'd be at every home game, that I'd be the family member who actually showed up instead of just claiming to. He asked if I really meant it, and I said absolutely, already looking up the football schedule online to mark the dates. We stayed on the phone for an hour talking about dorms and majors, and whether he should room with someone from the team. Mom called the following week with news about Dad that should have made me happy, but mostly just made me tired. He'd been fired from another job after only 6 weeks because his former company's HR department had provided references detailing his expense fraud. His reputation in his industry was destroyed, and he was struggling to find any work that paid more than minimum wage. She said he'd called her asking for help, and she'd told him to lose her number. His sister had stopped answering his calls. The few friends he had left were distancing themselves after hearing the full story. Mom asked if I felt bad, and I told her honestly that I didn't know what I felt anymore. I sat at my desk that night staring at my computer screen and felt guilt creep in around the edges. Maybe I had gone too far with the fake bank statements and contacting his employer. Maybe destroying his entire life was more than he deserved, even after everything he'd done. Then I closed my eyes and remembered sitting at that Thanksgiving table watching Grandpa and Grandma walk out while Dad kept talking about how Tyler was the child he'd always wanted. I remembered standing in the hardware store while Dad told Carl that Tyler was the son who actually enjoyed building things. I remembered every Facebook post, every lie, every moment he'd made me feel like I was the mistake he had to tolerate, while Tyler was the gift he'd been waiting for. The guilt disappeared like smoke. Alli sent me a text with a photo of her engagement ring attached. The message said she was getting married and joked that hopefully this wedding would be less dramatic than the last one. I texted back congratulations and said I'd love to be in the wedding party if she wanted me there. She called immediately and asked if I'd be willing to bring Tyler as my +1, properly introducing him to the family as my brother instead of his dad's secret. I said absolutely, and she started crying happy tears through the phone, saying our family was better without Dad poisoning everything. We talked about venue options and dates, and she mentioned she wasn't inviting Dad because she didn't want him anywhere near her special day. Dad tried reaching out through various family members over the next few weeks. He called his sister asking her to talk to me, but she told him she'd consider speaking to him again when he took genuine responsibility instead of playing the victim. He sent messages through cousins I barely knew, asking them to tell me he was sorry and wanted to make things right. Each person who contacted me had heard the full story by now, and most of them told Dad exactly what they thought of his behavior before blocking his number. His sister told me during one call that Dad kept insisting everyone had turned against him unfairly, that he'd made mistakes, but didn't deserve to lose everything. She'd asked him point blank if he remembered giving that Thanksgiving speech, and he'd tried to claim it came out wrong. She hung up on him. I met someone at work named Rachel, who started in marketing the same week I got promoted. We grabbed coffee one afternoon when she asked about my weekend plans, and somehow the conversation turned to family. I told her everything about Dad and Tyler and the revenge I'd taken, expecting her to look uncomfortable or change the subject. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Dad earned every consequence he got." She didn't judge me for the fake bank statements or for contacting his employer or for systematically destroying his relationships. She just listened and then told me about her own father who'd cheated on her mom for years and how sometimes people need to face real consequences before they understand the damage they cause. We started dating a few weeks later, and having someone who understood made the whole thing feel less heavy on my chest. Tyler called me on a Friday afternoon, asking if I was free that weekend because he wanted to visit. I picked him up from the bus station Saturday morning, and we drove straight to the baseball stadium downtown. Dad used to promise we'd go to games together as brothers once Tyler was old enough, but that never happened because keeping his two families separate was more important than actually being a father to either of us. We bought matching team jerseys at the stadium shop and took a bunch of selfies in our seats before the first pitch. Tyler posted one to Instagram with a caption about finally getting to do the brother stuff we should have been doing for years. We ate hot dogs and argued about which players were overrated and booed the umpire's bad calls together. During the 7th inning stretch, Tyler turned to me and said this was the best day he'd had in months. I told him we should make it a regular thing, and he grinned and said he'd hold me to that. Mom called the following Tuesday with news that made me genuinely happy for the first time in months. She was getting serious with Owen and wanted me to meet him properly over dinner that weekend. I drove to her new apartment Saturday evening, and Owen opened the door with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. He asked about my job and actually listened when I explained what I did, following up with questions that showed he was paying attention. During dinner, he asked about my interests and my plans for the future, treating me like a person worth knowing instead of an obligation to tolerate. He told stories about his own kids and how proud he was of them, but he made space for me in the conversation too. Watching how he treated Mom made something tight in my chest finally loosen because she deserved someone who saw her value instead of treating her like a placeholder. My boss called me into her office 8 months after I started and told me she was promoting me to senior analyst. She specifically mentioned my integrity and honesty as reasons for the advancement, saying the company needed people who did the right thing even when it was difficult. I thanked her and walked back to my desk thinking about how I was succeeding by being everything Dad pretended to be. He spent decades lying to everyone around him while claiming to be a man of integrity, and here I was actually earning respect by telling the truth and following through on my commitments. The promotion came with a significant raise and my own office, and I celebrated by taking Rachel out to dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. Tyler sent me a screenshot one morning that made me laugh out loud at my desk. Dad had messaged him on Facebook saying he was in therapy now, and his therapist wanted him to make amends with his sons. The message went on about how he was working on himself and learning to be a better person, asking if Tyler would consider meeting for coffee to talk. Tyler's text to me just said, "El Mao, is he serious?" And I replied that Dad thought a few therapy sessions could erase decades of calculated lies and deliberate cruelty. We spent the next hour sending messages back and forth, making jokes about what Dad's therapist would say if they knew the full story. Tyler said his mom told him Dad had been calling her too, trying to get her to convince Tyler to give him another chance. Neither of us felt bad about laughing because Dad still didn't understand that you can't fix systematic betrayal with a few therapy appointments and some half-hearted apologies. I sat down at my computer that night and wrote Dad one final email laying out exactly what he'd need to do for me to even consider speaking to him again. Public acknowledgement of his lies to everyone he'd deceived, not just private apologies. Genuine apologies to Mom, to Denise, to Tyler, to me, to every family member he'd hurt with his speech at Thanksgiving. Proof of sustained change over years, not weeks or months of therapy. Evidence that he understood the full scope of damage he'd caused and was committed to being different. I wrote 3 pages detailing every requirement and ended by saying I knew he'd never do any of it because it would require actual humility and genuine self-reflection. I hit send and felt nothing. No anger or satisfaction. Just the tired acceptance that some people never change no matter how many consequences they face. Tyler started college in August and joined the football team just like he'd planned. I drove 2 hours to watch his first game on a Saturday afternoon, finding a seat in the stands where he'd be able to see me. He spotted me during warm-ups and waved, this huge grin spreading across his face. I watched him play and cheered when he made good tackles and felt this warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with revenge or Dad or any of the mess from the past year. This was what family was supposed to feel like, showing up for each other without conditions or lies or hidden agendas. After the game, Tyler jogged over to the stands and we took more photos together, both of us sweaty and happy. He introduced me to his teammates as his brother, no qualifications or explanations needed, and they invited us to a team dinner that night. Mom called me in September with news that made me tear up on the phone. Owen had proposed and she'd said yes, and she wanted me to walk her down the aisle at the wedding. I told her I'd be honored and that she deserved someone who treated her like she was valuable, not like a placeholder until something better came along. She started crying and said she wished she'd left Dad years ago instead of wasting so much time on someone who never appreciated what he had. I told her she couldn't have known because Dad was good at lying, and what mattered now was that she was happy. We spent an hour talking about wedding plans and venues and guest lists, and she mentioned she wasn't inviting anyone from Dad's side of the family, except his sister, who'd completely cut him off. I heard through family gossip that Dad was living in a studio apartment across town and working retail at a department store because he couldn't get hired in his old field. His reputation was destroyed, and no company would touch him after the expense fraud came out. Part of me felt satisfied knowing he was experiencing real consequences for once in his life, instead of charming his way out of trouble. Part of me just felt tired of carrying around anger that didn't change anything. He'd built his entire life on lies and manipulation, and now he was facing the reality that actions have consequences. I didn't feel guilty anymore about my role in exposing the truth, because I'd just removed the scaffolding holding up his fake image. My therapist helped me work through the complicated feelings during our session that week. She explained that I could acknowledge Dad's consequences without taking responsibility for his choices. He'd built his entire life on lies, maintaining multiple families, and deceiving everyone who trusted him. I didn't make him do any of that. I just stopped pretending everything was fine and let the truth come out. She said carrying guilt for someone else's bad choices was a burden I didn't need to carry, and that Dad had countless opportunities over 14 years to be honest, and chose deception every single time. We talked about how I was building a real life now with people who valued honesty, and how that was the best revenge possible, because I was becoming everything Dad pretended to be, but never actually was. Tyler and I started video calling every Wednesday night, which felt right because Dad used to call me Wednesdays during college. We talked about Tyler's classes and my job and the stupid things our coworkers did, and we made a rule that Dad was off limits unless one of us really needed to bring him up. Tyler told me about his football practices and how his coach was teaching him new defensive strategies, and I told him about the project I was leading at work and how my boss actually listened to my ideas. We laughed at the same jokes and discovered we both hated mushrooms and loved old action movies, and it was weird realizing we probably would have been best friends if Dad hadn't spent 14 years keeping us apart. During one call, Tyler mentioned he was thinking about getting a dog once he moved into an apartment that allowed pets, and I sent him links to local shelters near his college. We were building something real based on who we actually were, instead of who Dad tried to make us believe we should be. Alli's wedding happened in June, and it was perfect. The ceremony took place in a garden with white flowers everywhere, and the sun shining through the trees, and there was no drama, no surprise guests, no champagne glasses hitting the floor. Tyler and I stood together during the family photos, both wearing dark suits and matching ties that Alli had picked out. We smiled at the camera and put our arms around each other's shoulders, and afterwards 3 different relatives came up to tell us how much we looked alike. Tyler and I looked at each other and started laughing because it was so obvious once you saw us together, the same nose and jawline and eye color, and Dad had spent years keeping us in separate boxes when we could have been brothers all along. Alli hugged us both and said she was glad something good came out of that disaster at her first wedding, and Tyler said he was too. I got a message from Willow through Facebook in July. She said she wanted to thank me for telling her the truth before she moved her entire life across the country for Dad. She'd been packing her apartment in Chicago and getting ready to quit her job when I showed her those photo albums and proved Dad had been lying about everything. The message said she was engaged now to someone named Matthew, who she'd known for years. Someone honest who didn't have secret families or fake life stories. She said Matthew treated her like she mattered and showed up when he said he would, and she was grateful I saved her from making a terrible mistake. I wrote back telling her I was happy for her and sorry Dad wasted her time, and she responded that it wasn't a waste because it taught her what real honesty looked like. I saved that message because it reminded me that exposing Dad's lies had helped people I didn't even know that well. Mom married Owen in September at a small venue downtown with flowers on every table and candles everywhere. She wore a simple white dress and looked happier than I'd seen her in years, maybe ever. During her vows, she talked about finding real love after spending decades with someone who only loved himself, someone who treated her like a placeholder instead of a partner. Her voice cracked when she said Owen showed her what it meant to be valued and respected and actually seen. Grandpa and Grandma sat in the front row crying happy tears, and I realized our family was actually stronger now without Dad in it. We'd lost the person who held us together through lies and gained the freedom to build something honest. At the reception, Owen pulled me aside and thanked me for being there for Mom during the divorce, and I told him I was glad she found someone who deserved her. He shook my hand and said he'd do everything he could to make her happy, and I believed him because his actions matched his words. Tyler called me in December right after he checked his grades online. He'd made the dean's list his first semester, pulling a 3.7 while playing football and adjusting to college life. He was so excited he could barely get the words out, talking fast about how he'd studied every night after practice and how his professors said he had real potential. I told him I was proud of him, and I was glad he was my brother, and he went quiet for a second before saying that having me in his life made leaving Dad behind possible. He said knowing he had real family who cared about him for who he was made it easier to cut off someone who only cared about the image Tyler represented. We talked for an hour about his plans for next semester and whether he should declare a major yet, and I felt this warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with revenge or Dad or any of the mess from before. I realized sometime in January that I hadn't thought about Dad or revenge in weeks. I'd been too busy with my actual life, meeting friends for dinner and working on projects at my job and planning my visit to Tyler's next football game. The anger that had consumed me for months after that Thanksgiving speech had transformed into something better, something lighter. I was genuinely happy, surrounded by people who valued honesty and showed up when they said they would. Dad's consequences were his own doing, the natural result of building an entire life on lies and manipulation. I didn't need to keep checking on him or worrying about whether he'd learned anything because it didn't matter anymore. I'd moved on to building something real while he dealt with the ruins of what he'd destroyed. On Thanksgiving, exactly 1 year after Dad's speech about Tyler being everything he'd hoped for, I hosted dinner at my apartment. Mom and Owen came early to help me cook, and Tyler drove 2 hours after his morning practice. Grandpa and Grandma arrived with 3 pies and stories about their neighbors, and we all crowded around my small dining table with our knees bumping and plates overlapping. Before we ate, we went around the table saying what we were grateful for, and when it got to Tyler, he said he was thankful I exposed the truth, because it freed him from Dad's lies. He said he used to think he was special for being Dad's favorite, but now he understood he was just another prop in a fake life, and learning the truth let him build real relationships instead. Mom squeezed my hand under the table, and Grandma wiped her eyes, and I said I was grateful for everyone here who chose to be in my life, instead of treating me like an obligation. I'm genuinely happy now, in a way I never was when Dad was around. I'm surrounded by people who chose to be in my life, People who show up and tell the truth and care about me for who I actually am instead of who they want me to be. Tyler and I talk every week and plan visits and send each other stupid memes that make us laugh. Mom calls to tell me about her life with Owen and asks about my job and actually listens to my answers. Grandpa and Grandma drive up once a month for lunch and tell me stories about Mom when she was young. These are real relationships built on honesty, instead of the fake connection I had with Dad that was based on him pretending I was good enough until something better came along. Dad lost both his families because he never valued any of us enough to be honest, and I gained a real family by refusing to accept his lies anymore. He's alone in his studio apartment working retail because he destroyed every real connection he ever had, and I'm here with people who actually care. Life worked out exactly the way it should have.